Today we are starting our new series, My Story, God's Glory. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be hearing stories from different people and how their stories reflect the glory of God. And today I get to begin by sharing a little bit about my story. I was addicted to cocaine. I worked as a prostitute. One night I got drunk and I killed somebody. These are the kinds of stories that I would hear growing up in the Adventist church. Whether it was at church itself, whether it was a week of prayer at elementary school, whether it was a chapel service at high school or academy, or perhaps a Vesper service at college. Whenever someone got up to share their testimony, I knew that we were in for a wild and crazy ride. And these stories were good. They were powerful. We would be sitting on the edge of our seats. They would elicit tears and laughter and a whole variety of emotions. And they were good. And we would leave the place charged and energized, hearing these stories of how God's power created these turnarounds in people's lives. And as powerful and as good as these stories were, though, it was difficult, I think, for some of us, at least myself, to identify with these powerful stories, with these testimonies, because that was as far away from my own story as could possibly be. I grew up in a stable Seventh-day Adventist house, going to church even before I was born. I loved going to church. In fact, my parents tell the story that when I was first learning to talk, there was a landmark about halfway between our church and the house, halfway along the route, and whenever I would see it, I would say, "Church," because I knew that's where we were going. And I loved going. I loved going to crater roll and banging the sticks. I loved going to kindergarten and putting the felts on the board. I loved going to primary class. And in fact, when I was 9 years old, I went to my pastor and said, "I want to be baptized." Totally unprompted, unencouraged, just this is what I wanted to do. And the pastor looked at me and said, "You're too young. Come back in about a year or so and then we'll talk." So the countdown began. Counted down the days, and just a few days after I turned 10, I went right back to the pastor and said, "I'm 10 now, baptize me." And so he did. And it was wonderful. It was a fantastic experience. But time passed. And soon I became a teenager. Then I went to high school at San Gabriel Seventh-day Adventist Academy. And life just got consumed with the things that consumed the lives of teenagers. Friends and school and homework and sports and drama, all that kind of things. And so it wasn't like I didn't like God anymore or love God anymore or care about God anymore. Just I had all these other things going on, and God got pushed to the back burner, the way back burner. I would still go to church. I still enjoyed going to church, even though it was mainly for my friends. I would hang out in the lobby, like some of our teens do. Except at my church, we had a deacon that would come by and make sure everyone was in the sanctuary, at least by the time the sermon started. I'm not saying that's what we need to do here. Or am I? But this was my life. This is how things were going. I was just drifting away from God and had no real intention of drifting back the other way. But things changed when I was 17. I was a junior at San Gabriel Academy, and they said that there was a program happening, Junior Senior Bible Retreat. And I said, "Oh, that sounds great." Not the Bible part, but the retreat part. I get to go. You're telling me I get to leave class, leave school early on Friday. I get to spend a weekend with my friends out in the mountains. I get to spend a weekend away from my parents. I get to spend a weekend looking for the cute girls from the other academies that were going to be there. I mean, Loma Linda Academy had like 1 million students, so there's bound to be plenty of cute girls there, right? So that's why I went. I didn't know that weekend was going to change my life. The speaker was okay. The music was good. Nothing was spectacular. Nothing was mind-blowing. But that weekend, it changed everything. I had grown up knowing who Jesus was. In fact, I couldn't remember a time when I didn't know who Jesus was. I'd been baptized at 10 years old. I had heard the stories. I had sung the songs. But there, that weekend, when I heard about Jesus, when I heard about his death on Calvary, when I heard about the forgiveness of my sins that he freely offered and the salvation that could be mine, things began to click like they had never clicked before. This is a picture of that weekend there with a group of my friends. And as those things clicked, as things started to make sense in a way they had never made sense before, I felt God calling me. Not just calling me to follow him truly and genuinely and passionately, but I felt him calling me for me to give my life to him, and more than that, for me to give my career to him, to become a minister of the gospel. And this threw a huge monkey wrench into my plans, because that was nowhere near the path that I was set out on my own. At that time, my intention was to go to Harvard, perhaps one of the other Ivy League schools, but probably Harvard, to study international banking. I had a 4.0 GPA. I had scored really high on my PSATs, in fact, the second highest in the history of my school, which had enabled me to obtain some very nice scholarships. I had knocked my SATs out of the park, 1,500 out of 1,600. I was involved in a lot of extracurricular activities. I was in the National Honor Society. I was student body president. I had a really good resume for getting into pretty much any college I wanted to get into. But that weekend, God said, I know you want to apply to Harvard, but how about you apply to Pacific Union College instead? And so that's what I did. I took a step of faith. I listened to the call of God, and I applied to PUC. At PUC, I dedicated myself, threw myself into my schooling just as much as I would have if I had gone to Harvard. And at the end of my time there, I had another fantastic resume. I had graduated with 2 degrees, a bachelor's in communication, a bachelor's in theology. I had taken a year off to do student mission work. I had worked several jobs and received glowing letters of recommendation from professors, from pastors. I had spent several years, summers, working as a volunteer pastor in several different churches. I graduated not with just 2 degrees, but I graduated with honors. I completed the honors curriculum. I graduated summa cum laude with almost a 4.0 GPA. And after all of that, not a single conference wanted to hire me as a pastor. There I was, just with another sparkling resume. There was not a thing I feel that I could have done to make my resume better, and yet no one wanted to hire me. I tried to brush it off, tried to pretend like it didn't really matter. If you had talked to me at that point in my life, I would have said, yeah, it's okay. I'm sure something will work out. But inside, I was disappointed to the extreme. I was devastated. I knew that if I had gone to Harvard and had that same resume, if I had gone to any other college and had that same resume, I would have gotten at least one job offer, if not multiple job offers. But here I had stepped out in faith to follow this God's call in my life, and I had a big fat 0 to show for it. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I decided to move to Loma Linda with some of my best friends, my closest friend, as they had gotten into medical school. They rented a large house, and I rented one of the rooms in the house. I figured, well, I'll try to get a job down there. Come to find out, it wasn't easy. So I eventually started to try to find work even at temp agencies. During that time, I was broke, like really broke. Like I couldn't go out to eat with my friends unless they decided to be generous enough to pay for me. Finally, I did get a job, though, through the temp agency at a company called Paychex, which is an organization that processes payroll. And it was life-draining. Because this was not what I wanted to do. This was not what I had been called to do. Don't get me wrong, I really loved to be able to eat and to pay my rent. But the type of work and the environment just drained the life out of me. Don't get me wrong, if you happen to work for a payroll company, there's nothing wrong with that at all. If you love, putting out payroll and fixing all those numbers, making sure all the FICA is taken out and all those good things, more power to you. But I knew that this was just not for me. That God had called me to work for Him. And so working for anyone else was deeply unsatisfying. I would continue to check websites of various conference church headquarters to see if they were posting job openings for pastors. Hardly anyone ever did. The only conference really that posted any type of job opening was the Northern California Conference. And one day I looked on there and I saw that they had a posting available, opening for a position in the communication department. And I thought, well, I have a communication degree, and this is working for the church headquarters. So it's not quite really pastoral ministry, but it's a whole lot closer than working for a payroll processing company. And so I thought about it, I prayed about it, and then the next day, or maybe the day after, I went on to fill out the application, and I found that job opening had been removed from the website. And so I, again, felt this wave of disappointment wash over me. Like, really, God? Like, you're closing that window even? What is happening? So I continued to go to this life force draining job at Paychex. And I was thankful to be able to continue to eat. But I knew that there was something more. And I felt that every day I continued to show up at Paychex was a day that I was getting farther from my calling. And so one day it just got to be too much. and I knew that I had to resign. I didn't have a job offer. I didn't have anything else lined up. But I knew that I could not keep going this way. And so I met with my supervisor, I met with my boss, and I turned in my resignation. And I went home that evening and thought, well, let me look at these websites again. And I think that God was trying to teach me a lesson there. That perhaps it's important for me not to fully depend on my own efforts, on my own hard work, on my own sparkling resume. That perhaps I needed to more fully depend on Him. Because when I checked those websites that evening, I found that communication position had been reposted. And so immediately, without hesitation, I filled out the application and I sent it in. And a month later, I started working at the Northern California Conference in the communication department. I couldn't believe it when they offered me the job. I was so relieved, so happy, so excited to have finally landed my first real job. But more than that, it was satisfying to feel that God had been paying attention to me, that He hadn't turned His back on me, that He hadn't called me on this journey of faith just to leave me blowing in the breeze, that God was actually willing to honor my faith. When I was hired, the conference presidents, the administration said that this does not mean in any way that we will ever hire you as a pastor. There is no, you are hired just for this job. There is no guarantee of any other future employment or anything of that nature. And I said, fine, that's okay, I understand. No big deal. I was just happy to actually be in the ballpark of my calling. And so I had a good 2 years there. But after about 2 years, even though I still felt fulfilled to an extent, working for God, working for the church, I knew that this still wasn't my calling. And so I wrote a letter to some of the conference administrators, the department directors. And in this letter I said, I know this was never part of the deal, but I have been called to the gospel ministry. And is there anything that you can do to help me live out that calling? And I heard crickets. Nothing. And so I began to think about sending myself to seminary, to go on my own to Andrews University and to take out loans and make my own way through seminary, because I had heard that almost everyone that graduates from the theological seminary there in Andrews with a Master's of Divinity, that pretty much everyone gets a job offer out of seminary. So I thought about that and I looked into it, and I decided that was what I was going to do. So 6 months after I had sent out that letter, I was ready to resign and move on with this next step. It was still a little frustrating because I felt I had still had a good resume. I still had done hard work, and to not even hear anything back from anyone, not even a thanks but no thanks. So right before I turned in my official resignation letter, I said, I'm going to send one more letter out. I wrote up a letter, and this time I sent it to the president of the conference directly. I dropped it off at his secretary's desk, and 30 minutes later, the president, Jim Pedersen, was at my desk saying that the conference would be glad to hire me as a pastor and to send me to seminary. And so I was really blown away. It still chokes me up a little bit. After all those years of hard work and ups and downs and disappointments, to know that God was still listening to me, was still aware of me, and was still honoring this journey of faith that I was on. I still needed a little bit more faith, though, because at that time, school was about ready to start, and even though I had already applied, even though I had already sent out letters of recommendation to be sent to this school, I had not received an official acceptance letter. But I called the enrollment office, and they said, well, I don't know, we know we've gotten some of it, and it's still, bureaucracy. The wheels turn very slowly. But I had to be there because classes were going to start in a week. And so I stepped out in faith again. I loaded up my 2-door Honda Accord with as many of my possessions as it could handle. I sold the rest or donated the rest, and off I went. I had no idea where I was going to go, where I was going to stay. I didn't know anybody at Andrews. I had no connections whatsoever. And so as I made that 3-day road trip to Michigan, I would pause occasionally and make a post on social media as to where I was. I'm out in the middle of Oklahoma and I see nothing. Along the way, though, one of my friends replied to one of my posts and said, hey, I know someone there at Andrews that rents out a room or two in his house. And so I connected with the guy, and he said, yeah, I have a room for rent. So I arrived at Andrews, and I had a place to live right there on campus. But I still didn't know if I was actually going to get in the program or if I was going to just sit there and twiddle my thumbs for 6 months for the next semester to start. I prayed and I said, God, I'm following you here. I've heard your call and I've stepped out in faith multiple times. Help me. And I got an email the day before classes started saying that while this isn't an official letter of acceptance, we were at the meeting where they voted all the people in and your name came up and you have been accepted. So please show up at class tomorrow morning. And I did. And for 2.5 years, I worked hard, applied myself, learned a lot, grew a lot, and graduated. And 10 years ago, that was 10 years ago. And now, I am standing here as the privileged pastor of the Tracy Seventh-day Adventist Church. It has been a journey. And this is only part of my story. I've only focused on maybe more of the professional journey that I've been on. There's plenty of things that have happened in my personal life. And perhaps I'll be able to share that part later. But this morning, I've shared this with you. Not knowing perhaps if someone here needs to hear this. I hope that this story has resonated with some of you. To hear that God doesn't always work in explosions and fireworks. Sometimes God shows up in an email, in a job offer. Sometimes he shows up in a friend of a friend. And sometimes those things can change your life. The thing is, though, that we have to be listening to the call of God. We have to be listening for His voice, and we have to be willing to take those steps of faith. I don't know, perhaps, what call God has placed on your life. I don't know what steps of faith that you have already made and that God is calling you to make again. But I know that in my story, when I have been focused on the call of God, when I have stepped out in faith to follow that call, that even though there are ups and downs, even though it is not an easy thing to step out in faith, even though sometimes when you do step out in faith, you're going to stumble, you're going to fall, you're going to feel disappointed and hurt and angry. You're going to think that you missed the boat, that God isn't listening to you, that God has turned his back on you, and you begin to wonder and question and wrestle with a whole variety of things because you start to doubt the moves that you have made in faith. I'm here to tell you that even through the ups and downs that come with being on a journey of faith, that you can stop along the way and look and find that your whole journey is filled with stories of how God has been faithful to you. That your whole journey is filled with examples of stories that you can share that radiate the glory of God. And perhaps even those darkest of dark moments, even those moments of severe crises of faith, that perhaps even those moments shine the brightest with God's glory. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 5 to 7 says, "It is God who has made us ready for this change. He has given us His Spirit to show us what He has for us. Our life is lived by faith. We do not live by what we see in front of us." This is the passage that my life story resonates with. The ability for God to speak to me, and the faith to take step after step, easy step, difficult step, but to continue on that journey because I want nothing more than to follow the call of God. This morning, I do not know where you are at on your journey. I do not know with what things you are wrestling. But I know that God has called each and every one of you. He has called all of us to go on this journey of faith. It's not a journey that we can depend upon our own senses, our own eyes, our own accomplishments, our own sparkling resumes. It is a journey that we can only depend on Him for. Because that is a journey of faith. So this morning, whatever your call has been, whatever the step is that you need to take, I pray and I hope that you can find a measure of encouragement from my story, because you have seen a glimpse of God's glory to give you the power and the strength to step out in faith yourself.